Happy Saturday. Welcome to the Northland Sports Page. Brian Prudhomme, Dave Cook, Topher Davis. It almost feels like we're frozen in time together here on this Saturday, but it's because it hasn't been that long since we talked last. How was your Friday, gentlemen? Because Thursday night we saw an awful lot of each other.
Yeah, Friday was a bit long in the morning, Brian, as I was recuperating from Thursday night, and then Friday afternoon and evening we did a bunch of COVID related activity.
Yeah, it was. It's been fun, and obviously we had a good time on Thursday night doing the draft stuff. But turns into a long evening, especially when the team that you're most interested in seeing how they draft trades back to the second to last pick of the draft.
Absolutely. It's as though the Vikings knew we didn't have much going, so they might as well keep us hanging with them for a little longer. Speaking of hanging with them a little bit longer, how about today? It's day 3 of the draft. We made fun of the Dolphins on Thursday for being on the clock every 2 minutes. That's the Vikings today. I don't know if that's good or bad because everybody, and I guess by everybody I mean Dave Cook, loves late round sleepers. The Vikings are banking on several today if they keep those picks.
It's just crazy how many picks they have. It's almost like they cut the lower end of their team off completely to save a couple of dollars, and now they're going to replace them with 5th, 6th, and 7th round players, which, literally we have 12 picks today. So every other pick isn't all that far off.
Yeah, it's going to be a ton of picks. I wouldn't be surprised to see what Rick's able to try to get done, but it's not like these are the most coveted picks as well. It feels a little bit like, I guess, you're building a lot of depth in your roster, but at what point do you start getting diminishing returns when you're dealing with 6th and 7th rounders?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like when you come back from Halloween and you're done with all the Snicker bars and the Reese's, and all that's left is a bunch of Jolly Ranchers and some Sixlets. And so, it's still candy, but it's not the ones you want.
Wow, that's Dave Cook at his finest. I didn't know that the NFL draft and Halloween candy could make a comparison, but we did.
And not a bad one.
Not bad. No, not bad. We'll let the viewers comment and figure out whether that was good or bad. But yeah, it's how many Tom Brady's can you compile at their respective positions? Because, when they look at the 6th round, that's who they go to, but they're not out there dime a dozen.
Yeah, and sometimes Sixlet candies are good, right? Look at some of the 6th round guys we've gotten. 5th and 6th round guys that are performing right now. And of course, we got a guy that grew up in Detroit Lakes that wasn't even drafted.
We do? Who would that be? And where did he go to college? All right, so Adam Thielen makes a mention without making a mention, but it's a good segue because Adam Thielen, I don't know if it's fair to put the expectations on Mr. Jefferson for this, but I think the thought is that Adam Thielen got a partner in this draft when you go to the first pick the Vikings did make back on Thursday.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that Jefferson has a lot of the traits that Diggs had as far as good route running, can grab the ball, can get in the open a little bit. And I think they're hoping without a whole lot of the drama that went along with it. So I think that was a pretty good pick. I also think it was a surprise pick to the Vikings. I don't think they thought he was going to be available.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think they thought he was going to be available. I think they were expecting. I know during our show we expected him to go the pick earlier to Philadelphia, and then when they elected to pass on him, it was like Jefferson's just there waiting for it on a golden platter.
Yeah. Well, and that was the crazy part too, because again, if you go back to the special that we had on Thursday night, if you haven't checked it out, do it in one of 4 segments or preferably all 4 segments on YouTube on this very channel and page, what have you. But if you look at the paralysis by analysis, which is basically how I summarize the NFL draft every year, or really any draft of any sport, but it was mock draft after mock draft after mock draft, had every different scenario you could think of. And then the pick that panned out went back to the very first one we ever saw, basically the day after Diggs got traded.
Yeah, you're right about that, Brian, and you're 100% right about the paralysis piece. It was interesting, especially yesterday, all the draft guides and all the stuff that I like to read beforehand. So many of the players that were drafted yesterday were panned in some of those documents. The one that was interesting to me was T. Higgins, drafted right away at number 33 yesterday. And you'd read that, the slow speeds, all those things were dropping him. And then when he got picked, it was like, well, yeah, but he's a great big guy with excellent catch radius, and a 4.5 is not all that bad. So it's always interesting, like you said, with the analysis driving people down. But the NFL, they don't care about the analysis. They know what they want.
Well, and again, it's who do you listen to? Because Topher and I basically listen to you. Because again, I could go Tobin on the whole thing and say who the bleep is Mel Kiper Jr., but I feel like he's the guy that everybody goes to. But there are different guys that slid. I mean, you look at Josh Jones. I had him maybe in the first round. Then I wanted him in the second round. I still wanted him when the Vikings took Ezra Cleveland yesterday in round 2. He
Yep.
didn't get picked till pick number 72.
Yeah,
Why
that's
was that?
crazy. Yeah, Josh Jones getting picked that late was just shocking to me. The other guy that's not picked yet that you read, has a chance in the early or mid second, maybe the early third, is Ben Barch from St. John's. He's still out there and available, and frankly, it wouldn't shock me if he's wearing purple next year.
Well, and that's the thing. And Topher and I can both weigh in on this here shortly. But, we have so many picks in day 3, assuming they don't make deals. You're going with sleepers or you're going with proverbial long shots. Not all of them necessarily, but is this a day where maybe you see the homer pick take place? Whether it's the kid from St. John's, whether it's Tyler Johnson, that kind of thing. What are you going to see today?
Well, I think that the one you might see late, if you want to talk local, is Carter Coughlin. I think Coughlin's going to, if he's not picked, he might be a priority free agent for the Vikings, because what they need guys who can play in special teams. There's some wide receivers from teams that aren't really great throwing teams that know what to do with the ball in their hands, right? They run sweeps or whatever. Those guys might be kickoff returners. Safeties that maybe aren't great at diagnosing but can hit, special team guys. Kamal Martin from the Gophers, who's not a read and react linebacker, but he can go play special teams and hit people. Those are the kind of guys I think you're going to, look at here late in the draft.
See, it's over. This is what makes it fun because Dave just came up with more names than I could have. The Vikings at least have to come up with a dozen if they keep their spots. I'm going to ask the casual fan in Topher this. Is it able to hold your interest this late in the game? Because I was all about Thursday more so than usual because of the pandemic and because of Dave basically being in his ultimate element. And I was more so into yesterday than I thought I would be. By today, Dave is one of my closest friends, so I'll feign an interest, emphasis on feign.
I think at this point it's more for a lot of fans. There's people that are locked in watching every single pick, and there's also people that are checking in to see what their team's doing, because that's what they want to see, and they're always going to try to find, and then they're googling the player because it's probably someone that they might not have heard of, and say, who is this guy and what can he bring to my team? Or they text Dave and say, hey Dave, who is this guy and how is he going to help us? I think that's kind of where a lot of people kind of are. They'll be checking in. They'll know around where they're picking. Obviously, Vikings fans are going to be checking in a lot with all those picks scheduled for today. But I do think that Rick's going to be trying to move a few of those, because I don't know how he's going to find the space to sign all those guys, even if they are at rookie minimum contracts.
That's very correct. Dave, I have to ask you about pick number 2, not round 2, but pick number 2, because that's your guy.
Ezra or Dan?
No, pick number 2 that the Vikings made at 31 on Thursday night. Mr.
Yeah.
Gladney, you had talked about him for days.
Yep, Jeff Gladney's the guy I want because of his personality and feistiness. I mean, he's a guy that'll go punch in the mouth. If you've watched any kind of video since, where they've gone and asked him what his greatest strengths are or talked to Zimmer about it, that's the one thing they all talk about, that he's the one that's really, really willing to get his nose in your business. No matter if you're 6'6" or if you're 5'5", he can cover you and he'll trash talk you. The funny one is Danzer, the one they got now. He is almost Trey Waynes without the speed. They say he's not super flexible, but he is willing to hit you. He's 6'2", but he's a little bit more savvy of a cornerback, if you know what I mean.
I do, and I'm glad you elaborated a little bit, because if you say Trey Waynes without the speed, to me, you've got just a guy, don't you?
Yeah, but you have to be willing to be super physical and have a good IQ. I think he's got a better idea what he's doing as a cornerback than Waynes did.
Well, you saw his nickname on Twitter, didn't you? His nickname is the Needle. He said, I'm skinny and it hurts when I hit you, so they call me the Needle. So I don't know very much about Mr. Dantzler, but if you want to give a little bit of a catchphrase or a catch quote to get people on your bandwagon, I think he did it.
Yeah, and I think that's a good explanation of kind of why I said he'll remind you of Trey Waynes. He's built that same way.
So here's a question, because Mr. Jefferson went first, followed by, of course, Gladney for the Vikes, and then Ezra Cleveland in round 2, and then Dantzler in round 3. If we take a look at it, of course, everybody wants their first round pick to pan out and be a superstar, and we'd love if he was. But based on the now, because we talk a lot about that too, is it in the immediate or is it in the future? Are we almost hoping that Ezra Cleveland is the best player the Vikings come out of this draft with, at least immediately? Because everybody, when they talk about the needs on this team, yeah, the secondary, of course, because of the offseason is elevated. But the offensive line, I said it, I'll say it again, a decade-long narrative. If Ezra Cleveland pans out, you've got a tackle. You can shove Riley Reef into the guard position. Your center you drafted last year is pretty good. Brian O'Neill is very good. Could you go from strength, or could you go, excuse me, from weakness to strength, actually, if the line pans out well?
At least from a weakness to something that's not a disaster, right? My fear is that Ezra Cleveland is a bit of a development guy. Not unlike what O'Neill was when we got him, and he proved to be a quick study. That's what we have to hope with Ezra Cleveland, because he's not really a big guy. I mean, he's tall, but he's not, he's not big. He's kind of a basketball player looking guy. But he came from a passing offense. He's quick. He's super athletic. And so the type of offense that they're looking to run, the type of offensive line that the Vikings value now, he fits that scheme pretty well. So yeah, if he comes ready to play right away, if he brings that football IQ like we were talking about with Dantzler, yeah, he could be valuable right away.
I agree. I think there's a lot of value for him right away. Coming to that you mentioned the college he comes from and the type of offense they run. He seems to be a good fit for Gary Kubiak's system. He's familiar with blocking for Alexander Madison, so that's interesting as well, coming out of Boise State. And it'll just be interesting to see. I know that there was discussion of whether Jones could have been the guy or not in that position. My voice is dying on me. But, yeah, I think that Cleveland's going to be a good spot for the Vikings. But I agree, Brian, that he's the one I think Vikings fans are hoping has the most impact right away because – the offensive line. How many years now? I mean, you mentioned a decade going.
I'm probably
Since
being
2009,
nice.
I think, is the last time that they had an offensive line that was worth anything.
That's correct. Now, here's a question because we talked about this a lot on Thursday, too. Can you be a victim this early in your career, being that they haven't even played it down yet, just because of expectations? We talked about Jefferson being asked to replace Stephon Diggs. If he thinks that way, it's going to be a difficult first season for him. What about with Ezra Cleveland? Because fans aren't going to say, okay, well, they took Ezra Cleveland well ahead of Josh Jones. What they might say is Ezra Cleveland is here because Trent Williams isn't. I hope to God that Ezra Cleveland doesn't feel like he has to come in and be Trent Williams on day one.
Well, I wonder about that because it sounds like Trent Williams is the guy that squashed it. It doesn't sound like the Vikings didn't offer enough or anything like that. And so I don't think that'll be a problem. I really don't. I don't think the statement's going to be, well, Trent Williams didn't want to be here because we were going to draft Ezra Cleveland. You know what I mean? There must have been something with the location or Zimmer or something that he didn't like.
Well, you would hope that it wasn't Kirk, right? Because they were teammates in Washington, or was it? Because, he probably knows Kirk, pardon the expression, but inside and out. And maybe he knows, hey, this guy didn't exactly lead a huddle the way that I want to be part of a team. Now we're grasping at straws because we don't know that. But
Right.
there are guys that love playing with Kirk. There are probably guys that didn't at all. Maybe they saw the deer in headlights bit. We don't know what goes into decisions. I think it's twofold. I don't think Trent Williams wanted to be here, but I don't think Washington felt they were going to get the value from us either because all we did was offer one of our plethora of day 3 picks that we're looking at today.
Well, I think it's really interesting because Washington continues to paint themselves into a further and further corner with this too. Because if you're not going to take a fourth and a fifth from the Vikings, who's going to offer you more than that right now? I mean, you maybe get a player and a fourth or a fifth, I suppose. But I mean, there's not a lot of people out there, a lot of teams out there right now desperate for a tackle.
Well, and why is it that the only veteran player that you're hearing in draft day circles of transaction, if you will, is basically Trent Williams? Because I'm sitting here going into today going, the Vikings got a dozen or so day 3 picks. I don't really want them all. I believe they've got 13 to be exact. Couldn't they package something to get a proven player of some variety? Now, I don't want to go down the Odell Beckham Jr. rumor mill because that really never got started, and you're not going to get him for a plethora of day 3 picks. But is there a proven corner? Is there an offensive lineman that isn't maybe Trent Williams caliber that it could at least be shopped? Because what disappoints me is you're sitting with a ton of picks that, whether you like it or not, are mostly going to be reaches. If you can't shop them for a veteran, then you shop them for picks down the road. But your GM and your coach aren't under contract down the road. What do they care what you have in 2021 at this point?
Yeah, but you're right about maybe moving up for a third round pick next year because Spielman has to assume that he's coming back. Otherwise, yikes. Because then you do trade all your picks for, maybe not top end talent, but at least people that can play in the NFL. Another name that's tossed around, and we've talked about needing a 3-tech, and then maybe a defensive end is the Namakwe kid from the Jacksonville Jaguars, who has said he's never playing another down for Jacksonville.
Well, not only did he say it, we've seen the text conversations. You think Stephon Diggs was a prima donna? My goodness.
Yeah, but he might be a guy that you could pry away from Jacksonville for the, maybe the first of your 4th-round picks. What about trading a bunch of them and get both him and Leonard Fournette, and then have Fournette and Cook in the backfield, huh?
I was muted so you couldn't hear my audible laughter, but Dave's already in fantasy football mode, because if that happens, yes, the Vikings are playing fantasy football. Speaking of playing fantasy football, are the Packers doing that? Because they went, all right, we've got a really good quarterback, we got a pretty good running back. Let's use the draft to get a future, hopefully fairly good quarterback if you're a Packer fan, and a future, hopefully fairly good running back. Okay. So they're not bad picks necessarily, because they may not be bad players down the road, but you're not addressing weaknesses now. Now you can argue they don't have very many because they were in the NFC title game last year. I don't think it's fair to completely mock them, but it's certainly legit to question the decisions. I heard a rumor that they'll have a better day 3 because Clete Blakeman is going to come in and make the decisions for the Packers, because all the decisions that he makes at least work out in their favor.
When you hear some of the biggest Packer fans we know lampooning their draft, we're not the only ones. We're not just picking on them. But you're right. It sounds like a dynasty fantasy football draft where you're hoping. I think the funniest thing about this is, they get the quarterback for 5 years, right? And Rodgers has 3 full years left in his contract. So the 4th year, right, the year that they're going to have to make a decision on whether or not to extend Love already. And you're not going to know, right? If Rodgers isn't going to give this position up, you're going to have 1 year of the kid before you have to make a decision.
I think you're right. That's going to be interesting to see the way that plays out, especially with obviously the history that Aaron Rodgers has being that guy in that position with Brett Favre ahead of him, and how cold and icy Brett Favre was towards Aaron Rodgers. It'll be interesting to see if he either learns from that or if he just does the same thing. It's hard to tell. I heard that maybe Rodgers was going to, treat Love like he's a member of his own family, and bring him in that way. So
exactly.
We'll see how that works out.
I hope Jordan Love has a great shoulder, because he's going to get a cold one from Aaron Rodgers without question. Yeah, Dave laughed at the Aaron Rodgers joke. Apparently the Clete Blakeman one went uncatchable right over his head. But at any rate, it's interesting to me because the best things that I've seen on Twitter, of course, there's rumor number 1 that, okay, Aaron Rodgers is going to be a Viking now in 3 years because the history is going to repeat itself completely. One that I liked is, do you realize that the Packers quarterback room now has A-Rod and J-Lo? Gotta love that one. Gotta love that one. So it's interesting because is it a bad pick? No, but does it help you now? Not at all. So I think everybody's going to question what they're doing, but you know how Packer fans are. We've seen, we just got our Hall of Fame quarterback for the next 2 decades, while the Vikings will scramble to be a wild card team every year. I would love to have that kind of confidence in my team, but I like to be in touch with reality too. I think it's interesting because, of course, the powers that be, you hope they know more than we do, but this is probably the most that I've seen a high name draft pick get questioned because of the team he's going to. It's a position that's not of need for them.
I think what should happen here is the insurance commercial, the Mayhem insurance commercial should sign Love right now, because there would be no better marketing firm no other marketing plan than the insurance company that's chasing State Farm, whose headline is "Avoid Mayhem Like Us," signing Aaron Rodgers, who's a spokesperson for State Farm's backup, just to see what the mayhem might cause.
It's an interesting idea, that's for sure. Tell you what, it's going to be a storyline all season long of what kind of mayhem's happening within that quarterback room, because using a first-round pick on a team that had obvious holes defensively, a team that's built to win now, and Aaron Rodgers' window is closing. Wonder how he feels about them worrying about, already moving past him when he thinks this is a team that could win the Super Bowl next year.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing.
That's the problem.
Exactly. Rumor is that he's not pleased. Now, if I heard that my go-to quarterback was not pleased, I'm a Viking fan, so I don't know anything other than to worry, and that's what I would do. But now you have Packer fans going, oh, Rodgers is T.O., he's ticked off. but at the same time, we like him with a chip on his shoulder. He's just going to be that much better. Again, I wish I could be that confident in my team. I guess, history plays a factor there too. What has your team done for you lately?
Yeah, it'll be interesting because he's the one that, in order to win, puts himself kind of out there and he takes extra shots and whatnot. If they don't give him some additional skill, players around him, I mean, he's liable to play like his hair's on fire and get hurt.
Well, so here's the question: which Jordan does Aaron have a more cordial conversation with first? Jordan Love, or, oh, by the way, his brother is Jordan Rogers as well. But I digress. I want to go back to what Topher said during our draft special, because one of the things that I liked that he said was it took it back to its roots a little bit when it was basically just a bunch of guys with computers. At that point, I think they were in a hotel banquet room. So it brought us back a little bit to a different era for the NFL draft. And I want to talk a little bit about different eras in sports because we've also talked about how many classic games we've watched. Because what other choice do we really have? There is no current game to be watching. The WNBA draft, the NFL draft are the most current things we've been able to watch. So as we watch classic games, has your respect grown for any particular era in a different sport? Is there time travel that you'd like to do and go, because I watch 80s and 90s basketball and I go, that's the way it should have been. I'm very partial to that. It was a lot more fun to watch. Some of the pitching back then versus now was much better. The offense maybe wasn't. One could be responsible for the other. But is there an era that you're going, I kind of missed that?
Go ahead, Toph.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if necessarily I kind of miss that. When I think of it, it's almost like not necessarily that I miss it, but that I missed it because I wasn't around yet. So I think of like 50s and 60s baseball. I'd love to go, go to the Polo Grounds and see the New York Giants, go to Ebbets Field, and be able to watch, that era of baseball when, if just to see maybe if it is maybe glamorized a little bit because the documentaries make that type of baseball look like that's when baseball was pure and it was amazing. And also go to, check out some of the Negro leagues and some of those players and maybe when, integration's getting started and seeing how that's all happening because they were just those players, the Hall of Fame names are absolutely amazing. And maybe it's, it's part of there were less teams, so there were better players rose to the top. But yeah, for me, that's what I was thinking. And I, for baseball, that's definitely the 50s and 60s, I think, for me.
Yeah, I agree with you, Toph. I think that the lack of teams did. The teams were just better because all the bottom end major leaguers that you have right now, those guys wouldn't even sniff the major leagues back then. But it's interesting because it is the late 40s to like 1968 that I would like to be involved with because of the huge names and the pitching and then the integration. You're right, and the stadiums that we'll never get a chance to see again. And yeah, that's the generation for baseball that I'd like to go back to. I know that for hockey, it would be the late 80s, early 90s when scoring was, I was doing a little bit of work for our draft later, our Wild North Star draft. And the plus minus stat, I don't know if it's a great stat for hockey, but if you look at the top North Star players, the only guy who is a plus is Neil Broughton. I mean, like Brian Bellows is a minus 82. I mean, forget about playing defense, man. It was just score, score, score.
No doubt about that. And speaking of score, 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 you guys talked about baseball. I'd go back even further because for me, 1927 Yankees, I'm not a Yankee fan. I've established that, but those guys are like mythical creatures to me. I mean, when you talk about, who's the best player ever to play baseball, a lot of people say Babe Ruth because he hit like he did and he pitched like he did. Well, other than, John Goodman in a movie and a lot of home videos on Extreme Fast Forward, what it looks like, Babe Ruth is almost, was he real? I'd love to go back and find out kind of thing. And then, I had a great friendship with Mike Cuellar when he was part of the Dukes. And he told stories of those Orioles rotations. And he talked more about hitting than he did pitching because they took pride in that too. I would love to go back to an era when pitchers hitting wasn't such an embarrassment. Would that be fun to watch for any of you?
Yeah, I agree with you, Brian. I think that time would be. Here's a question: if we didn't have the video of Babe Ruth, and we didn't have the fact that the statistics that he had were real because they were around other people, would he kind of be a sports Paul Bunyan? Like he would be a legend.
Yes, I think he is. I
So
think he is
yeah,
anyway, to be honest. I think he's almost a mythical creature to just about everybody. I mean, Jackie Robinson obviously is different, but I go back to what Topher said with integration and things like that, and I think that's an interesting time too. But you go back to, we talk about the Chicago Black Sox and the controversy with 1919. Honestly, I think, and I'm being very tongue in cheek when I say this, if it wasn't for root beer, most of us forget about what is 1919. But honestly, I mean, there's baseball has such a history. It's not 50 years old. So many of us in Minnesota, in particular, equate everything to being roughly 60 because Minnesota got a lot of its sports around 1960, 61. But so much is so far before that we only heard about, we didn't see, we could see. Personally, for me, for the Twins, even you think back to our all-time Twins teams, I loaded up on the older guys because I swear my dad's voice was in my head as I was drafting, but I'm trusting him. I never saw one inning of any of those guys.
well, there's teams from other players too. I mean, think of Rogers Hornsby, who has all these huge numbers, and when you talk first or second baseman, you just look at numbers. He's the best second baseman of all time, except he couldn't stay on a team. It would be so interesting to watch him play and how just kind of what it sounds like a jerk of a guy, but puts up so ridiculous numbers that looking at him now with no context, we say, with those numbers, how could there have ever been anybody better? Ty Cobb's that way. Dizzy Dean, I think, is a little bit that way. Just the name brings back statistical memories that we don't really have memories of, visual memories.
Right, and I think it'd be interesting to take kind of our present day sports fandom world and bring it back to a world like that where there's no social media. There's a newspaper beat guy, but he's probably drinking and smoking with all the players every night anyway. So he's right there with them because it's just a different world. You talk about some of these guys being terrible guys. I mean, in Field of Dreams, they didn't invite Ty Cobb back because no one could stand the guy when he was alive. So so it's interesting to see how different everything would have been for baseball. I mean, it's got the longest history, so I think the game is and the game is still pretty much the same when it comes between the lines and on the diamond. It's as it is now as it was then. There's obviously been some changes, but the rules are pretty similar.
I would agree with that. You talk about social media changing things, and there's no question that it did. So people would say, well, if Babe Ruth was alive during social media, his career would have been about 2 weeks. But would it have been? Because if you put social media in that era, things that he would have posted or done or got posted about doing wouldn't have been considered awful either. Would it have been a wash? I mean, what he did wasn't, oh my goodness, what's he doing? There was a little more, I don't want to say tolerance, but maybe a little less sensitivity back then too.
I think that, yeah, I 100% agree with the sensitivity part. I think he would be one of those must follow guys. I think that he would be the guy that everybody was following online because of all the other escapades. I think social media would have been good for some of these guys. I do agree that some of them would have. I don't think social media would have been good for Ted Williams. I think his brashness and grit probably would have washed up. Pete Rose probably wouldn't have been a great follow.
Well, it
Some
would
of
have been a
those
gamble to follow him.
yeah, he'd be on DraftKings. He'd be the follow guy there. So
So I got to
yeah,
ask Topher the easy question because it is going to be a hockey day a little bit later. Topher, do you want to go back to the 80s for hockey just because the North Stars are around? If we can go to the 80s and the
Yeah,
90s
yeah.
just because they're still
I'd
here and
say
Norm Green doesn't
80s.
suck yet?
Yeah, exactly. Definitely the 80s, maybe the 70s and 80s, I think, just because the North Stars are around, the Met Center rocking a little bit, the Cup run in 81. Also being able to see the mythical Edmonton Oilers teams in their heyday, Gretzky as he was coming up, and just to see them at their prime is something that, I mean, Dave mentioned the amount of scoring that they could do, but that's crazy good. Be able to see Grant Fuhr, how he could do it. When Wayne Gretzky still talks about him being the one goalie he would pick to play in a one game playoff game to win a game for him. It would be really amazing to see that stuff.
Dave, I
well,
just want to go
we
back to when the New York Islanders would matter because for my lifetime, that hasn't been a thing.
we forget about Lemieux and Yager came up at that time too. They were just kids at the end of the Edmonton Oiler run.
Well, and even in the 90s, I wasn't a huge fan of them because they were too good, and I never got behind who was too good. But you think about the Red Wings with Yzerman and Fedorov in that group, and Nicholas Lidstrom. And oh, by the way, if you got in the way of any of those guys, Bob Probert would put you on the ice for good. I mean, there's fighting all the time, and some people frown about it now. But well before Derek Bugard, Minnesota folks, there were plenty of enforcer types. In fact, there were a lot more guys that played both ways in that sense. I'd like to go back to that a little bit. The guys that would rough you up also had some skill.
I think that it would take care of a lot of the stuff we complain about in hockey now, for sure. All that cross-checking that you see in front of the net, Zach Parise would get cross-checked because of how he plays. Not near as much if somebody was running that defenseman who was cross-checking Zach Parise all the time.
Well, I think the other
Right.
thing, and this is personal for me, is I'd like to go back to say, 1984 through 93 or 4 in any sport. And I know your memory is supposed to get worse as you get older, and you guys talk about my memory being too good all the time. But there's something about I can rattle off who won the World Series from 84 to basically 93 without thinking about it. If you ask me who won the World Series 3 years ago, I don't remember. And I don't know if that's because as a kid you didn't have adult responsibilities, but I just feel like when I see these games from the 80s and early 90s, I remember them play by play almost. You show me a game from 2 weeks ago, well, we can't do that, but 2 months ago, and I don't remember what happened. And I don't know why that is, but it makes it fun for me to go back because I was so engrossed in it. I still am now, but it's different.
Well, Brian, I think I can 100% agree with that, and that's one of the reasons I like your brain is because you do that, and I'm like, oh, that's right, because this happened and that happened, because I don't remember all that stuff perfectly either, because back then I was where you are now.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. Thinking back to when you're a kid, and you mentioned not having the maybe necessarily adult responsibilities or why you were so locked in, but sports were a mythical time. You talked about the early '90s Twins for me, and then the '90s hockey. You were talking about obviously that's a darker spot because the North Stars left. But at the same time, I was still watching a lot of hockey. The playoff battles between the Red Wings and the Avalanche every year, it seemed like those games were a battle. Those series were something special, and I was still paying attention. And it was back when ESPN even paid attention to hockey.
Right, that's 2 weeks in a row that Topher's taking the slam at ESPN on hockey, and it's warranted, so I don't have a problem with it. Does it really boil down to we want to go back to maybe when we were most impressionable? We're not saying we necessarily want to be kids again, but we know what a big deal it was at that point. Because if you look at it, I mean, in basketball, which we haven't talked as much about, you're getting that debate right now because of the Jordan documentary that's airing. You're getting Jordan versus LeBron at the forefront again, and what you're seeing is people that grew up with Jordan are voting for him, people that grew up with LeBron are voting for him. So isn't it a matter of what did you see and what made you impressionable?
100%, Brian. 100%. If you were a kid that grew up during LeBron, you didn't even see Jordan, right? So Jordan was as important to somebody who's not seen him as, say, George Mikan is to somebody my age. You talk to Dad, and he's like, George Mikan could do anything he wanted. Well, George Mikan is just a name to me. And so if you were a LeBron guy, Michael Jordan is a couple of video clips. I mean, it doesn't mean much more than that to you.
I agree with that, but here's a question then, just being a little bit of devil's advocate here. That happens in basketball, and maybe doing sport by sport is not exactly apples to apples. And I agree with you. You make a perfect point. I mean, CJ Osuchukwu was on Fox 21 this week, and he said, babies that were born in the 2000s, they only see Jordan on the Wizards. And that's not what we want people to remember either.
Yep.
But so that happens in basketball, and I respect it for the timeline. Yet, I think if you talk to today's baseball players, or baseball fans that are younger, are they really going to take Mike Trout over Willie Mays or Babe Ruth? Is there more of a respect for the history of baseball than anything else?
Yes, I 100% agree with that. And Trout might be a not a great example. More of an example might be, and again, this is because of how old I am, might be a guy like Roger Clemens or Barry Bonds, including the steroids, where you look back at those guys and Roger Clemens this, Roger Clemens that, and the old timers say Bob Gibson did everything Roger Clemens did except he hit you in the ribs. And if you like Gibson, Drysdale, and then they keep taking steps back because the level of play, like Topher said, the game hasn't changed all that much. So you can compare 6'4" right-handers who will hit you in the ribs at any time they can in order to take their part of the plate. We understood what that means. But you get into somebody like Magic Johnson. We don't even know where Magic Johnson fits in the greatest players of all time anymore, right?
Well, I think we do, but I think if you argue with different generations, it would change. That brings up a different point too, because you've got some franchises that have multiple options here. The Lakers might be number one. Some people now consider LeBron a Laker. Yes, he's on the team, but I don't look at his career that
No.
way. It's the last stop. But they've got Magic, they've got Kobe. They can debate forever. Hockey pundits can go, well, Sid and Mario played for the same team. Gretzky's still above them both for me, but there's a debate there within the franchise. Boston too. You can go with Havlicek and Russell. You can transition to Bird. I don't think you transition to the big three after that, but there's still, when they played in the same spot, I feel like there's more respect for each generation. When they differed wholeheartedly, that's when you get more of an argument.
I think with baseball, the other thing you have is when we talk about the greats of all time, nobody really did see them. I mean, even up into the 60s and 70s, really, baseball was a regional sport. Yeah, they played each other, but Cub fans didn't get to see, they didn't get to see the Dodgers. They came by once a year, but so the mythos, as we talked about earlier, Drysdale might have been the scariest pitcher of all time if you're a Cubs fan, because all you heard was he hit another two guys who crowded the plate. But in hockey, we got to see those guys. There are players, or there are kids right now that to them, Gretzky was 5'10" and 160 pounds and would get killed in this league. So yeah, he had a lot of great numbers, but he's not really that good of a player. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is interesting that when you talk like that, because also it's also gets into as television grew, the availability of being able to see all these guys live grew, and in baseball specifically for the longest time. American League and national teams never played each other until the World Series. So then you really wouldn't get to see half the league, really. If your team wasn't going to be a World Series team and only one team goes every year, they weren't going to come to your town to see them. We brought up hockey and kind of the generational thing of where Gretzky would fit in. It's hard to tell. I know just this past week, Lou Nanne was asked that very question, and he said Gretzky is still the greatest player, and he'd figure out a way to he was smarter than everybody else, and he would be just fine, and he would score a lot of goals still in today's game. It's interesting to see someone like that who knows hockey history speak that highly. And I know that Lou Nanne has a different feeling for people up here because of the high school tournament, but there's no doubting how much hockey he's seen in his life as well.
Right. As long as you're south of Hinckley, you're certainly on Lou Nanne's radar first and foremost. But I think it's interesting too because we made great points for a lot of sports, but at least baseball and hockey, even though the eras make differences, the game is still generally the same. You look at basketball, and how do you compare when the icons couldn't shoot a three-point shot? Not that they couldn't shoot it, there wasn't one. That makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it was funny when you were talking about the Lakers and you didn't mention Jerry West, right? And he's the shield.
He's only the logo, yeah.
Right. So I think you're 100% correct when you talk about guys who can't shoot the three. Who's the last small point guard who was considered all great? Curry's not a point guard, right? So think John Stockton. Can John Stockton play today? Could
that depends. Is Karl Malone coming with him because they never played separately?
Yeah, we talk a little bit about Craig Elo when it comes to Michael Jordan, but could Craig Elo play today? Where would Allen Iverson fit? He played at a whole different speed than everybody else did, but he also didn't shoot threes. So the small guy in the NBA, when you look back, where does the small guy fit?
Well, that's a good point. You're talking about bringing those guys up. Where would a guy like Steph Curry fit in the NBA in the 80s or before the 3-point line?
Right.
What would his purpose be? So he can get across half court and shoot, but he's getting the same as the guy that goes in for the layup.
Yeah, the game's changed a lot that way.
Think about the big guys. Think about Bill Russell. Think about Wilt. What would Shaq do today? If Shaq came up today and he was a back to the basket mauler, those guys don't even have spots in the NBA today.
Well, but I think they would, because I think one of the debates is this. Back in the 80s for sure, and we can go back considerably further, you could get mauled and a whistle wasn't necessarily going to happen. Now you can get sneezed on and get to the free throw line. Shaq could still have that in his repertoire. Of course, the converse of that is two things. He can't shoot free throws worth a lick, And then secondly, there could also be an offensive foul for the way that he used his posterior when he played.
Yeah, see that, but he didn't run the floor, and he wasn't a good shooter. And if you look at centers who don't, they're very very few and far between who played that game. Rudy Gobert. I'm not sure who the next center is that plays that type of specific game. Most of those guys now are pick and pop, and they have range out to 16 to 18 feet. Wilt Chamberlain was not going to shoot threes, right? Bill Russell wasn't a 3-point shooter. They were pounded underneath the rock. And the question, the guys that we've even seen, Brian and Topher, Olajuwon, where would he have fit? And he was the most athletic center that we've seen to that point.
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, basically what we've come up with here, and it's not breaking news that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but is it essentially saying that whoever you think the best player in the game is, unless you have an off-the-wall favorite, you're probably right, because you're probably going with an era that is nearest and dearest to your heart, and they're probably the best player of that era, period.
Yeah, that's true. Here's a question for you. We pine Rajon Rondo because he's got some skills. He plays hardcore defense, but offensively he's kind of a black hole, right? Where would Rodman have fit in today?
Well, anywhere he felt like it, because do people forget that he was a stat stuffer with rebounds? Everybody just likes to see his flamboyant personality.
Yeah, but he was simply a rebounder and a good defender. So see Kenneth Faried. I mean, one of my favorite under the radar basketball players. I mean, he can't find a spot in a roster because all he does is play with high energy, defend, and rebound, but he can't score.
But see, I wonder if it depends on how much of a student of a game you are. Maybe we're pigeonholing the basketball too much, but it's a know your role kind of thing. If you find somebody that doesn't need the ball every time, you cherish that person now because they don't exist.
I think you're right, and that's one thing with Rodman. Actually, he, for as much of a look at me guy he ended up becoming throughout his career, he played on some really good teams. It was a great teammate both with the Nasty Boys in Detroit, and then obviously with the tail end of the Bulls dynasty. And he became an ultimate teammate when it comes to on the floor itself. Obviously, he became a bit of a distraction off the court, but on the court, he was fine getting 2 points a game as long as he get his rebounds and help his team win. I think he would find a role someplace in today's game. He would need the right team around him, but I still think he would be all right.
I think he would too. I think the question becomes, would he even be noticed? I mean, he'd have to be that flamboyant to even make a box score headline these days, because he would be, and this is going to segue into our other topic, he would be, believe it or not, instead of overhyped, underappreciated today. That's what I think Dennis Rodman would be.
Yep, I think you're right.
So I want to talk a little bit about underappreciated too, because we all know about the big moments in sports, the big plays that are done time and time again. Kirk Gibson's 1988 World Series home run, Kirby's Game 6, Jack Morris's Game 7. We know the narratives that remind you of certain events, but win or lose, you always hear players say, well, it's not just about that one play. There were plays before it that helped us win, plays before it that caused us to lose. What are some of the more underappreciated plays in sports? Dave, I'll start with you because I gave you more time to study this.
Right. Well, we were talking about this earlier in the week, Toph, and you may have seen this article. It was in The Athletic this week. They talked about Game 7 where the Wild came and beat the Colorado Avalanche. And we also remember Nino's wrist shot, right? But the play that led up to that was Danny Heatley, who had been sitting. I mean, he was a scratch most of that series, playing on the defensive end, which he didn't do often, making a 40-foot sauce right onto Kyle Brodziak's stick for the breakout. 2-on-1, Brodziak made the pass for the goal, but nobody ever talks about Heatley's effort doing something that he didn't do it, akin to Vince Coleman hitting a 2-run home run, right? It's something that Heatley wasn't a defensive guy, and yet his play allowed for probably the biggest moment in Minnesota Wild history.
Yeah, it's that moment's definitely right up there. And Heater's a guy that obviously is much maligned for his time in Minnesota Wild because, he scored 40 in 07, but that was before he ended up with the Wild, never was able to replicate that and became a bit of a, distraction. But you're right, that play, he was, in the playoff situation, he put himself in the right spot, made a good, strong defensive play, and made a beautiful pass out to Brodziak, who's another underappreciated player, in my opinion, in Wild history, Kyle Brodziak. And then, Nino finished it off. Nothing more you can say about that play.
I love that you brought up Kyle Brodziak because if you've ever heard the audio of that goal, all you can hear in terms of chatter on the ice in a very silent Pepsi Center is Kyle Brodziak being the first person to notice that Nino scored. I mean, it's Topher, you do your Christopher impression, but it's almost yeah is all you hear. I mean, Kyle Brodziak is going completely bonkers, and it's a great example of how that play developed. I'd even go back a step further. We're not in overtime without a brilliant goal from Jared Spurgeon in that same game.
Again, in the history that was written, the talk about it is how Spurgeon got the puck on his stick and easily could have shot right away, right? But a Colorado guy was sliding in front to block the shot. And in that pressure-packed moment, Spurgeon had the wherewithal to take one quick stick handle while that guy slid by. And then he took the shot to Barrie.
So we're talking about game sevens against Colorado. I'm disappointed that I don't remember this exactly, but maybe Topher can help me because before the Nino goal, there was the Brunette goal. Who brought it in the zone? I can't remember if it was Zoltak or Sekerash or who it was, but there was somebody else that Brunette was able to trail and get open because of.
Right, yeah, there was a trailing play, and then he got it dropped to him, and then he made the nice play in front of the net to bury it past Patrick. Well, I can't remember. I think it was Sergei Zoltak. He was right in there. I know that you mentioned Spurgeon's big goal to tie the game. Marian Gaborik tied that game in 03 with just a few minutes remaining in that game because the Avalanche looked like they were, set to go. They scored to take the lead. They were in control of that game late in the third period, and then Gaborik on a wild power play late in that game was able to get a pass out front from, I believe, Wes Walls, and he was able to get that one past. That was a huge, huge goal, and that's another guy that obviously he had a ton of talent, put up a lot of huge points for the Wild, probably their most talented player as far as Wild, but he was at a point in his career where he didn't have much around him, so he maybe had a lot of pressure for a young guy coming over, but he scored a huge goal right there for Minnesota too.
So what about if we go to baseball? Because baseball has the most iconic moments to me. And the iconic moments are circled or number one with a bullet. But you look at so many things that had to happen to get them there. I'll start with the Twins. Everybody talks about Gene Larkin won it. And maybe they don't talk about that enough because they talk about Morris. They talk about Kirby getting them there. Is Gene Larkin the most overlooked? Oh, yeah, he won the game, by the way. But is it because the table was set perfectly?
Yeah, I think you can point to a lot of guys like that. Dan Gladden is probably overlooked on that team for some of the defensive things he did in that game. If I remember right, he made a couple of really good plays in left field.
He did, and it's interesting because just last week, Dan Gladden was one of our top choices for the overappreciated fan favorite. But yes, it's the leadoff double
in that game
that leads to that game-winning run. By the way, Chuck Knobloch bunted him the third. Whether you love or hate the sacrifice bunt, it changed the shape of the whole inning.
Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right.
Think are generally overrated can certainly be superstars in a moment. That's 100% true.
When I look at Kirby in Game 6, and I watch the top half of that inning, and Brian Harper, of all people, threw out a pinch runner to thwart an Atlanta rally. Brian Harper was pretty awful defensively. He showed up there and set the stage for Kirby. That's huge.
Yeah, when you're able to get those plays and get those big outs just to allow a team to go to another inning, and a guy like Brian Harper who maybe he was no Pudge Rodriguez, right? When he was throwing out runners, anything like that. So he
was probably more like Ronnie Rodriguez.
Exactly. He's able to make a big out and at a big spot as scoreless or in a game at that point in the game, and in order to allow that next bottom half of the inning to happen like it did is a big play. And even I know it's talked about still, but Chuck Knobloch's play defensively where he got Ron Gant to think that was it Ron Gant? I don't remember who the Ron was exactly.
Lonnie
Smith, you're right. It was Lonnie Smith. He faked that he had the ball coming to him and just slowed him down just enough, and that play alone might have saved that game.
Does anybody miss, speaking of Lonnie Smith, does anybody miss how forthright broadcasting used to be? Because I don't feel like they cater to athletes so much, but they don't really call them out as much as they used to. Jack Buck flat out said, Lonnie Smith is held at third, and he didn't do a very good job of base running. And Tim McCarver follows up with, that was terrible. You don't hear things like that anymore. As much as I don't like Tim McCarver, the honesty was pretty refreshing.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think that our sportscasters wouldn't want to draw that criticism on themselves. They like that relationship with people and they like that, frankly, public relation. Can you imagine if the current Buck was to do something like that around us or the Packers, the two fan bases that think he's against us anyway? I mean, it would just be confirmation, right?
No doubt about it. And I could even turn this into the Brian Harper show again because I think of the big double play in Game 7. You think of the 3-2-3 double play that got the Twins out of
Yeah.
it. You see that over and over again. I saw a replay a couple times and I'm going, man, Brian Harper, there's such a good chance that he could have hit the runner with that throw, thrown the ball into right field. And we don't win that World Series if that happens, in my opinion. Obviously, you get last raps as a home team, but it changes it completely. And I keep watching that replay going, that might have been one of the first times that Minnesota things didn't happen to Minnesota because that throw should have gone somewhere else.
That Twins generation was different, though, man. When things needed to go their way, they usually did. I mean, granted, when they were losing a ton of games, it didn't matter. But when they were in tight spots, they made stuff happen positively. And maybe that was the Tom Kelly way. I'm not sure. But, yeah, those tight spots, they didn't throw the ball away much.
Right, and that kind of brought me to made me think a little bit about it. It's fun as a fan when your team has those things clicking your way a little bit. It reminds me of the UMD Bulldogs hockey teams of recently, when they're trailing by a goal in the third period. I'm not stressed out yet. I'm like, all right, this team's going to figure out a way to win it. And they've been able to do it as of late. And it's a fun position to be in because so many times, especially as Minnesota as a whole sports fans, it's a glass half empty. It's oh no, the sky is falling. Of course, we're not going to win this game. We're going to find a way to blow it rather than find a way to win it.
Yeah, maybe that ties back into the first topic, Dave, because I talk about an era that I'd like to go back to. I'd like to go back to when I wasn't such a pessimist about Minnesota sports. Maybe we should go back to that.
Okay, so you remember anything about pre-birth? Because I sure don't.
No, but I think
we're born with pessimism.
But I think when I was 8, which would have been the first World Series win for the Twins, I think I was young enough to believe that they're going to do this.
We just come from different places, man. My dad would be the one who'd say, all right, so understand that this is, if this happens, great. What does he say? An optimist can never be pleasantly surprised. So if he believes that things are going to go sideways and things goes great, he's more excited than anybody else. And if things go bad, he's not as disappointed. He's like, yeah, I figured that was going to happen.
So we always talk about World Series walk-offs, and Gibson Game 1 is known by everybody. Kirby's Game 6 is known. Gene Larkin, I just pushed for to be a little bit more known, but you can argue that the defense was in, the infield was in, the outfield was in, the bases were loaded with less than 2 outs. All he had to do was lift it in the air. That's what he did. How come nobody, at least south of the border per se, talks about Joe Carter actually winning the World Series with a walk-off home run? Why is that one so overlooked? You talk about World Series home runs, and at least recently, and it's not even that recent anymore because you're on 20 plus years, but it's Gibson and it's Kirby, and I've seen it 50 times during COVID-19. Where's Joe Carter in this?
Was that 93?
Exactly right.
So he might have gotten overlooked a little bit because, as you say, with the Twins, for you it was like, oh yeah, they always win, right? Because it was 88 and it was and then it was 91, 80, 86, 91, and then Joe Carter right. I got it. The Joe Carter home run came in 93, and so it had just kind of been Gibson's home run, Puckett's home run, Carter's home run. It was just another walk-off home run, right?
But it wasn't just another one. It won the World Series. The stage was not set. It didn't have the Gibson drama, but Gibson gave them a 1-0 lead in the series. Joe Carter won the darn thing. The call was perfect. The call gave it the respect. History has not.
His running around the bases is one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is a iconic moment and is capped off. Obviously, the 92 and the 93 Blue Jays were some teams that were really, really good. But I wonder as well is that maybe the foreshadowing of what was going to happen in 1994 and the fact there was no World Series and the strike happened and all that chaos might put a damper on history of that 93 as kind of I could see the argument both ways. Maybe is why 93 should be even more heralded because it was the last of that generation.
Absolutely. Think of what we're in now. COVID-19 has erased sports. We got a virtual NFL draft. We got a WNBA draft. They both were followed more than they would ever be. because we needed something. The strike season of 94, you should have given 1993 a huge hug, especially the way it ended. And again, I'm pushing for Joe Carter, who I hated, by the way, because he killed the Twins with the Jays and he killed the Twins with Cleveland, too.
Yes, that's what I was going to add that part. Think about the passion of Joe Carter running around the bases versus how the 2017 Houston Astros would run around the bases. Joe Carter's throwing things. He's got his jersey untucked. Jose Altuve is running across with his arms across his chest because he doesn't want anybody to see the wire.
Well, I was going to say, to be fair, he couldn't have his jersey untucked because all the technology would have fallen out, and the
It was a
infielders
bad
would have been
tattoo,
like,
guys.
the infielders would have been like, "Excuse me, you dropped a microphone. I don't know what you dropped. What did you drop coming around the bases here?" But it's interesting that you bring up Houston because you look at the pitching performances of World Series, and Morris is first, but then what Verlander did is right behind it. How come nobody talks about Don Larson throwing a perfect game in that setting?
Well, I think
I only remember it as an answer to a trivia question.
Right. That's the answer. Is nobody remember? I mean, how about the Giants win the pennant? The Giants win the pennant on a home run. So it's because you just, I mean, nobody around, hardly anybody around remembers.
Yeah, I think it's because of how long ago it happened and things like that. Obviously, it's a huge accomplishment. Both, Don Larson and then Bobby Thompson's shot heard around the world. But it's just, I think it's just a fact that we weren't there yet. Us personally.
So is that basically it? We're not talking necessarily underappreciation. We're talking about memories fade with time. And I'm not talking about your memory because we're bringing them all back up. But I mean, if it happened 10 years ago, we're all about it. If it happened 20 years ago, we're less about it. If it happened 60 years ago, we're not even sure it happened anymore.
Well, we were talking before you came on, Toph, about something way back. Athletic were at that top 100 and it got to Henry Aaron. And about the day that Henry hit the 755, right? No, the one that beat Ruth's record, whichever number that was.
That would be 715.
715. Thank you. That he got to the batter's box and he had faced this pitcher before, and all the pressure. Everybody's watching this, right? And he takes a 4-pitch walk, and that led to him when he came up the second time to be pretty relaxed because the first at bat, the one with all the pressure, was gone, and then first pitch. The pitcher didn't want to walk him again, so the first pitch was hittable, and Aaron hit it a long, long way.
Well, and you mentioned taking a walk. If I remember, Gibson's home run came with 2 outs, and it was a 2-run home run. That means somebody else got on in front of him. I think it was Mike Davis, but do people talk about that either? It's all Gibby all the time.
No, I quick found something though, Brian. I thought you might like, and your mom will certainly like, and that's the 2009 season.
Aaron Boone?
No, Johnny Damon. Earlier in the series, when it was 2-1 Yankees on the series, and it was the Phillies, right? They were playing.
Yes, that's correct.
The Phillies were up by a run, and Johnny Damon walks, steals second, steals third, and then A-Rod hits the tying it was tied. A-Rod hit the go-ahead run in to make that series a 3-1 series, when a 2-2 series would have changed the whole dynamic.
Totally off topic, but a bit of a segue off of what you just said. Is Johnny Damon one of the oddest polarizing players in baseball? Because recently Twitter ran a poll of who was the best all-time Twin, and it came down to 2 left. And I don't necessarily agree with the bracket that had the 2 left. It was Kirby versus Joe. And Kirby won going away, and you can guess which one I campaigned for. But somebody who was on the Mauer side of it said, well, Mauer's F-WAR and Mauer's WAR is monstrously higher than Kirby. And I went, okay, if you're going to come at me with WAR, I'm already going to declare myself the winner of this debate because I feel like it's almost like a made-up stat over the last 15 years. But then you look at Johnny Damon. Johnny Damon's career WAR is higher than Joe Mauer. If anybody wants to convince me who doesn't love Joe Mauer like everybody else does that Johnny Damon is better than Joe Mauer, I'm done talking to you. It's Mauer far and away.
Yeah, that would be the argument. Oh, Brian, I didn't know Damon was that good. So let's go back and realize why he's not in the Hall of Fame.
So then did we just switch from underappreciated moments to underappreciated players thanks to Johnny Damon?
Sounds like another topic for another day.
Oh, boy.
There we go. We go to the all underrated team at some point. But part of what made me want to do this is the Jordan special that's airing because you're realizing, and I think we probably already knew, but how good and therefore how underappreciated Scottie Pippen was.
Yeah, Scottie Pippen was. Remember when we started talking about players as being Batman and Robin? Scottie Pippen was the original Robin, and it wasn't a shot at he wasn't as good as Batman. It was Batman couldn't do this without him. Scott, again, a guy in a perfect situation. I mean, if he goes to with his skill set, if he goes someplace where he's the man, he doesn't have that kind of. I mean, his skill set was that he could do everything. Not that he was going to be a dagger scorer when he first came up. Granted, he could do it later, but when he first came up, he was kind of a Swiss Army knife. He was Stacey Ogman, and then you say, who's that? Well, it was a guy.
No, I don't.
Well, you don't.
I wore a UNLV jacket at the age of 10. I don't say who is Stacey Ogman.
Stacey Ogman was a guy that could do everything really well, but nothing spectacular. Scottie Pippen was that guy until a little bit later in his career, once he kind of knew who he could be and who he was. So, yeah.
So basically, I was Stacey Ogman because Topher's got hockey better than anybody. Dave's got the NFL draft better than anybody. I got nothing, but I can hold my own in all of them.
You're Stacey. What is it? What was his nickname? The Elastic Man? The Plastic Man?
I think that's right. Topher, go ahead.
What really struck me about the Scottie Pippen stuff was learning more about. I didn't know all of his entire backstory, being one of 12 kids in that household, and then not even being, he's at a Division II school, and as the equipment manager,
NAIA basketball, baby. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. And then has a growth spurt, and he's just practicing with the team, and he eventually works himself into a scholarship role, and then Jerry Krause gets much maligned, I think, for especially in this documentary. But his pick and finding Scottie Pippen out of Central Arkansas to go join Michael Jordan and making that trade to get him was a phenomenal move, because Scottie Pippen ends up being a great player. And it's interesting to hear players at that time talk about how underappreciated he was at that time, because he played with Michael Jordan. Because, there's people talking about he might have been the second best player in the league during portions of that dynasty time. Just happened to be he was also playing with the best player in the league.
You wonder if Chris Bosh isn't going to get nicked with that as time goes on as well. LeBron was the guy. Dwayne Wade was Batman. People might forget how good Chris Bosh was.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. I'd go further with the Scottie Pippen and the Bulls bit, because everybody, raise your hand if you've seen the replay of Michael Jordan over either Craig Elo or Brian Russell or both. We've all seen it, right?
Yeah.
What people forget is big shots in the finals by John Paxson to win, to beat Barkley and company. Steve Kerr, I believe, buried one in a similar fashion to help them win. Those would be another play that gets overlooked because it's another championship for Jordan. Yes, not without that shot. However, your counter argument is, well, if 5 guys on the floor surround Jordan, somebody's going to be open. Think of how good Dave's guy J.R. Smith could have been with LeBron if he just knew what he was doing.
Yeah, 100%. There's all kinds of guys like that. Think of how good those persons could be if they were smarter in their sports. Ricky Davis. I mean, Ricky Davis could do everything if he would have concentrated a little bit on his defense. Who knows how good he could have been.
Yes, he earned the name Ricky Avis for a reason, because there was no D in Ricky Davis at all. From one Davis to the other, Topher Davis, any underappreciated moments in hockey that stand out for you besides the wild goals that we went over?
Well, yeah, with hockey, it's one of those things, because it's such a team sport where the plays develop so much more. Rarely do you see guys pick up the puck and go coast to coast. So it's the guys battling in the corners and things like that. It's those type of players that may not put up the huge point numbers. The defensemen who end up don't score. They score 3 or 4 goals a year, but their teams know that they wouldn't be where they are without that guy. Marty McSorley with Wayne Gretzky. He's the guy that Gretzky didn't want to go anywhere without, because he knew how important he was to his team and just protecting him and that type of role.
Wow. It's been a long time since I've heard Marty McSorley was something good. All I think of is Mr. Brashear going, "Don't bring up Marty McSorley, please."
Wasn't he the guy that went back in time in a DeLorean?
That would be another Marty. Well done. Well played. Just like the Tiger King Simba, right, Dave?
Yes.
All right. We perhaps think we might be underappreciated as well. That'll do it for hour number 1. When we come back, we'll draft North Stars and Wild. We'll do a fantasy draft line by line. Stay with us. We'll be right back.